Welcome to the South by Southwest panel, Understanding the Motivation Behind Extremism. My name is Michael Duffin, and I serve as an advisor on countering violent extremism at the U.S. Department of State. This panel features some of the top experts who have worked directly with individuals radicalized to violence. Our first panelist is Dr. Heidi Ellis, an associate professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital, and director of the Trauma and Community Resilience Center. Dr. Ellis studies refugee youth mental health with a particular focus on understanding trauma exposure, violence, and how social context impacts development. Our next panelist, Dr. Stephen Wine, is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago's College of Medicine and director of global medicine at the Center for Global Health. For 30 years, he has been conducting research both with refugees and migrants in the US and in post-conflict countries, focusing on mental health, and violence prevention. Mr. Christian Picciolini, our final panelist, became a neo-Nazi skinhead at the age of 14 and spent the next 8 years of his life radicalizing and recruiting others to the Chicago area Hammerskins. Decades removed from the white power movement, Picciolini now helps others disengage through his organization, the Free Radicals Project. He is an award-winning television producer, author, and public speaker. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, extremism was on the rise globally. From Christchurch to El Paso, white supremacists were targeting minority communities in an effort to accelerate what they believed to be an impending race war. Extremism is not exclusive to one group or ideology. In Syria and Iraq, for example, thousands of volunteers of the so-called Islamic State, representing 100 plus countries, enslaved, tortured, and murdered those who disagreed with their extremist worldview. While our first inclination may be to call these people monsters or brainwashed, the reality is much more complex. This expert panel will discuss the personal, societal, and environmental factors that lead people to join extremist groups and how the tech sector can work with intervention providers to steer people away from such violent movements. I'd like to start with Dr. Ellis and Dr. Wine. A lot of people simply dismiss those who commit acts of terrorism as insane. Is this really the case? Are they neurologically wired differently? Dr. Ellis, please go first.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this really important panel. So it's a great question. There's really no evidence that that's the case. Research into this has resoundingly shown that psychological profiles of terrorists are really quite unremarkable. So the idea that there is some unique psychological marker or that these individuals are somehow wholly different from you and me has not really been borne out. That's not to say, however, that mental health or psychological well-being has no role to play in preventing terrorism. There is some research suggesting that mental health problems like depression or anxiety, in combination with other factors, such as being ostracized or perceiving that you're poorly treated by government, can create vulnerabilities to violent extremism. So I think mental health care and psychosocial support have an important role to play in helping to prevent violent extremism, even though it's clear that mental illness doesn't explain the phenomenon.
And Dr. Wine?
Yes, I agree with what Heidi has said, and I don't really think that we should be looking at terrorism as a reflection of a particular brain or psychiatric disorder or personality style. And you know, there are some studies that Heidi points out that show some trends, such as that 40% of persons who get involved in white supremacism may have had some kind of family trauma or violence or things like that. But I don't think we should look at these as generalizable to all or as even necessarily causal. And I think we should remember that there haven't been really good controlled studies that compares that to another group, because these things have pretty high rates in the population as a whole. So I think we should be careful about coming to conclusions. I, on the other hand, would suggest that we should be looking at terrorism more from a social perspective, and we should really think about the social processes that lead to involvement in violent extremism. First and foremost amongst those is the internet. and the online proliferation of hatred and extremism. Second is recruiters, in person or online, who really know very well how to sniff out vulnerabilities in people and motivate them to mobilize or join an extremist group. And I think we should also be really thinking about leaders, political leaders, cultural leaders, community leaders, who are supporting intolerance, discrimination, and hate, and do something about that. Thanks.
Christian, you've spoken to audiences around the world about your radicalization at the early age of 14. Can you walk us through the process? How long did it take to radicalize? And why would the son of an Italian immigrant find a nativist xenophobic movement so appealing?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and I appreciate being here too. I think it's really important to understand, like Dr. Ellis and Dr. Wine said, that there really is no general answer for why people become attracted to this. And my story is both similar but different than a lot of people that I've worked with. I am the son of Italian immigrants. My parents came to the U.S. in the mid 1960s, and they were often the victims of prejudice. So racism really wasn't something I learned at home. But because my parents are immigrants, they also had to work extremely hard. They were running a small business that kept them away from home 7 days a week, sometimes 14 hours a day. And I didn't see them very much. So while I knew I was surrounded by a lot of love and and support, I also wondered why I was abandoned. And I wasn't mature enough to ask them those questions. So I went looking elsewhere for it. And I think it's important to understand that ideology with the people that I work with and with myself wasn't the primary driver to go in that direction. Instead, it was kind of a broken search for three really important things: identity, community, and purpose. I had felt pretty invisible and bullied growing up, even though I was surrounded by a lot of love. So I went searching for those things, and I hit what I call potholes in my life's journey. And potholes are things like trauma. They are abuse, they're poverty, job loss, even privilege can be a pothole if it keeps us too separate from humanity. Mental health can be a pothole, health, and all those things that are difficult life experiences that are difficult to navigate. And they kind of detour us to the fringes where narratives of identity, community, and purpose are very loud and often toxic. And for me, at 14 years old, I was standing in an alley, I was smoking a joint, and this guy came up to me knowing that I was vulnerable for recruitment. And he drew me in knowing that I didn't really have any other outlets for that identity, community, and purpose. So I was willing to abandon everything that I had been taught, all the values that I was raised with, for this reward that suddenly kind of reared its head and it never had before. And I was willing to forget everything that I'd been raised on to kind of get something more tangible, even though I knew I was hurting people.
Dr. Ellis, you've conducted more than a decade of research on the factors that led some Somali refugees to support violent extremism. Based on your work, what makes someone more vulnerable to extremist propaganda than others?
Yeah, Mike, as you say, I've done a lot of research trying to understand this. It's a work in progress. My research has largely focused on Somali refugees, though I want to make clear that that's not because that particular group is more at risk than any other community. I started working there because there was a particular issue with some youth joining Al-Shabaab, which was a terrorist group in Somalia. But if you look population-wide, the rates of extremism are no different than other groups. So that said, the questions I was asking in that research had to do with trying to understand broad factors across a whole population that might create more vulnerability to violent extremist ideas. We collected data with more than 450 young adult Somalis living in the US and Canada, and we followed them over a period of 6 years, trying to understand not just attitudes towards violent extremism, but also more positive factors like civic engagement. What we wanted to understand was, what were the factors here in resettlement in the US and Canada that might nudge someone towards more or less constructive developmental pathways? And we looked at our data in every way imaginable. And I have to say, the story that kept coming up was a really simple one. It's all about social belonging. Within this group of refugees, those who felt welcome here, like they belonged in our country, like our government was looking out for them, they were the least likely to be open to the idea of illegal or violent activism. But those who experienced high levels of stigma and discrimination, especially when they were struggling with psychological challenge, such as trauma or mental health problems, those individuals appeared to be more vulnerable to violent extremist ideas. And I actually take this as really good news, because creating welcoming communities or working towards fair treatment by government or treating past trauma, these are what we call modifiable factors or dynamic factors, things we can change. So this helps, I think, shift our thinking from, oh, terrorists are born that way, to instead more constructive questions like, what we do in our communities shapes how safe we are. How do we make this a safer place for everybody?
Dr. Wine, you've met dozens of men, women, and children who went to Syria and Iraq. What inspired some of these people to leave their friends and family to live in a war zone?
Well, ISIS was really very effective in motivating young adult men and women from many different countries to come to Syria and Iraq, and even to bring their children or to start new families. And many of these people were raised Sunni Muslim in their countries. They really bought into the ISIS ideology of rebuilding the caliphate and defending the Syrian people. I think most came to that ideology either online or through some kind of associate that they got to know, in their country, who had already embraced the ideology. I think along the lines of what Heidi's saying, many such people, either were underemployed or unemployed or somewhat felt marginalized in their situation. And some of them were very willing combatants who wanted to fight and become martyrs. Others were really more motivated by humanitarian goals and building a state. I think there's one thing that I get from talking to these people is a sense of empowerment that they felt about all of a sudden being part of a movement that was very important. And also a sense of being very concerned about persecution of Muslims and wanting to defend Muslims through their actions. Of course, when they got there, they often found that the situation didn't live up to the ideas, the ideals that they had thought. I also want to note I've spoken with many women who were essentially escaping situations of really bad abuse in their families and with nowhere else to turn to. And so the idea of going to Iraq or Syria was like a good option. It was like an escape valve from a terrible situation. So, but I want to emphasize that an event like foreign fighters going to Iraq and Syria is a big tent event. And so many different kinds of people end up there, and we should be careful about making a generalization to all of them. Similarly, with like the US Capitol attack, also a big tent event. So for example, some people or recent studies have shown that maybe a third of them were affiliated with militias, but 2/3 of them were not at all affiliated with militias, were employed, were well off. And so I think that just reminds me we should be careful before making generalizations to the whole group.
And that leads into the question I have for Christian. As the former leader of the largest neo-Nazi skinhead group in the country, you use the protocols of the Elders of Zion and other anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to radicalize people. Why are conspiracy theories important to the radicalization process?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I think it's important. Conspiracy theories are important because they help spread fear and uncertainty. Even though the conspiracy theories themselves are very clearly to the adherents pointing, to answers, the fact that they exist, opposed to the reality of things, creates uncertainty. And I think uncertainty really is the one factor, if we were to generalize this, is the one factor that leads people to radicalization, or at least primes people for radicalization, because that opens people up to all sorts of kind of lottery ticket answers for their problems. And it allows them to also place the blame on the other. And I think, because things like the Capitol siege were a big tent event, and I agree with that, because we saw militia there, we saw, kind of just regular conservatives there who were caught up in that propaganda. You saw white nationalists, you saw Proud Boys, you saw all sorts of people. And all of those movements are driven by the same type of fear rhetoric, the same type of conspiracy theories that paint the other as the problem. So they were unified by that.
As we've touched on already, some of those accused of committing violence that day were longtime members of violent extremist groups, including the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, whereas others followed conspiracy theories from QAnon. Christian, are these two sides of the same coin? And how would you approach an intervention of a QAnon follower versus a member of the Proud Boys?
I don't think that they're two sides of the same coin, although they are, if the coin had multiple sides, more than two, they would be part of the same coin. They're all part of the same ecosystem driven by that propaganda. They're adjacent to each other, though, a QAnon person, could potentially not be a white nationalist, could potentially not be an Oath Keeper, and all those things. But again, they're driven by that. And what I would say to the second part of your question is, and I have had people reach out, family members of people reach out for help with their loved ones who are QAnon members. And my process is really the same. It is trying to identify by listening, not to the ideology, but filtering that out, but listening for those potholes that I mentioned earlier. And what I've found is that, it's not just young people who are driven and detoured by those potholes to toxic identity, communities, and purpose. There's also another really important vulnerable group, and that is retired people who are, older in age, because they have gone through a lot of adverse experiences in their lives, potholes, trauma, a whole lifetime of them, from job loss to divorce, grief, loss, all those things, and are also now searching for, in many cases, a new sense of identity, community, and purpose. They've even maybe moved to a new state after they've retired. They're developing everything all over again, and they spend so much time living on social media, places like Facebook, where that type of false propaganda is penetrating them. But what I would do is I would fix those potholes and then replace, very simply put, but easier said than done, replace the identity, community, and purpose that they've found there with something more positive. But it's never about debate. It's never, being aggressive towards them. It's really about understanding the motivators of what led them there, and then helping repair, the difficult to navigate points along the way that they hit that detoured them.
Dr. Wine, what do you think will happen to QAnon followers, since many, if not all, of the predictions never materialized? Will they return to their pre-QAnon lives? Will they continue following QAnon, or will they find a different rabbit hole to go down?
Good questions, Mike. QAnon is a destructive cult, and like other cults, it has a real strong hold on its people. And all those outcomes that you mentioned are possible. But to me, it seems more likely that they will stick with QAnon and double down on their belief system than they would simply give up on that. They also could be ripe for re-engagement into a different form of extremism. So other recruiters may try to pick them off. If in some there is disillusionment or disappointment, then I think that they would really need support to make a change. I don't think they're just going to flip into something on their own necessarily. So I think the challenge is, how can the rest of us, best help people to walk away from that kind of movement. So echoing kind of what Christian said, if this at an individual level, if this is your friend or family member or associate, I think it begins with listening. It begins with showing respect. It begins with providing them with new information that may challenge their belief system. It begins with introducing them to new people who don't share those beliefs. At a social level, I think we need community leaders to speak out openly against these conspiracy theories and denounce them. I think part of the responsibility of leaders, and again, leaders in law enforcement, in the military, in government, in religion, in education, the responsibility of leaders is to reinforce the truth, to encourage trust in institutions, to challenge disinformation, lies, and conspiracies. And then I'd also want to say that I think the families have a special responsibility and leverage here. There was a story of a young man, Jackson Reffitt, an 18-year-old guy whose father said he was going to do something really big a couple of weeks prior to the Capitol attack, and this son called the FBI and told them about his father, and they called him back on January 6th. This boy was very brave. Many other family members are not so brave. I think we need to do more to support family members who are aware that something is taken hold in their loved one and it could be dangerous. We need to support them to be able to reach out for help. We need to give them resources and communities so they can call and get help. Maybe they don't need to call the FBI. Maybe they just need to call someone like Christian who could help talk them down from some dangerous ideas.
Dr. Ellis, as Dr. Wine mentioned, interviews with family members of several of those who were arrested for their role in the violence that day revealed that they were estranged from their loved ones because of their extreme views. How can family members repair this relationship despite opposing viewpoints?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And it must be incredibly painful to watch a loved one head down a path that you fundamentally reject. And the desire to talk someone out of that is likely really strong. But I think, and this maybe reiterate something that both Christian and Steve were saying, trying to convince someone that they're wrong is not always the best way to go. It can have the adverse effect of driving them deeper into a viewpoint and rejecting whatever tenuous ties outside that view that they may have. So I think what's going to work better for families is to not take on the ideological disagreement, but instead to focus on the points of connection. So find the parts of the relationship that are holding up and work to strengthen those. So maybe it's a shared love of music, or you both care about a grandmother in the family or something. Focus on what's working and what you agree on and try to keep those ties and build them stronger. And while you're doing that, you have the opportunity, like Steve was saying, to make sure there are other ideas or people or activities or ways to feel, that sense of belonging and connection and meaning and purpose that we've all been talking about. And those initial ties that may be unrelated to the ideology, they can become the bridge out of something unhealthy and back into connection with family and society.
I want to stay with Dr. Ellis. I want to talk about the tech industry. There's been a lot of discussion about the terms of service for social media companies such as Facebook and Twitter. From a mental health standpoint, what are some of the signs we should be looking for concerning people who intend to harm themselves and or others?
So actually, I'm glad you asked this question right now, because as I was answering the last one about not confronting your loved ones, I was also thinking about the fact that there can come a time when you have to take action. And Steve was talking about this as well. If someone starts dropping hints, and they almost always do, drop hints that they might engage in something violent, then we need to move from being a bystander to being an upstander. And this is something that we see a lot on social media, that suddenly there's going to become more information, more detail, some more clear statements about planning to take action. And that's when we need to make sure we let someone know, make sure there's help for the individual, if necessary, bring in law enforcement, like the story we were just hearing about. Most of the time, someone who's going to engage in extremist violence does what is called leakage, where they start saying out loud, often on social media, that they're planning to do something. And that's certainly a time to say something.
Dr. Wine, what role can family members play in the disengagement process?
Well, family members could play very important roles. We know that families can really support the changes that people want to make. And so we need to understand the family situation and assess how to intervene. We know from working with people who in criminal gangs and cults that having a positive emotional tie with your family And a desire for a normal family life can really be a motivator. But we also know from working with some persons who've gotten involved in extremism that a lot of times the family might have been involved in encouraging the person in that direction. So I think it's very important to sort that out. And in some cases, we might need to create some distance between a person and their family that holds those views. In other cases, kind of like Christian was saying, there may have been family tension, conflict, abuse, trauma, and those things need to be, say, healed or addressed in order to have the family provide a supportive environment. In other cases, the family could be a real positive support for disengagement, and we might want to do everything to amplify that support, kind of like Heidi was saying, and to make the family an even better resource for the person who wants to make a change. And then I think let's also remember what we just said a few minutes ago, that even before the person has declared that they want to disengage, we need to really think about family members who are aware that something is going on with a loved one, but don't know where to turn. I think that our communities, our mental health system, our law enforcement system offers far too few resources to help to guide and support those family members who want to do the right thing by their loved one and by public safety.
Dr. Ellis, going to you. You live and work in Boston, and obviously, 8 years ago they had a horrific attack where the mastermind radicalized his brother to help him perpetrate that violence. What are your thoughts on how what can be done if another family member is enabling this violent behavior?
Yeah, I mean, social belonging is an incredibly powerful need for people, and families can be the center of this. I mean, I think we heard that from Christian. So the need to belong to your people, your closest group, can be a very powerful motivator. Earlier, when I was talking about my research, I talked about how a sense of belonging can be protective, but what we're talking about here is really the flip side of that, how social networks can also operate in the inverse, and they can be reasons people join violent extremist groups. What you're going to do about that is going to depend a lot, of course, on the age of the individual and the dynamics of the particular family situation. But in broad-based terms, what I would say is this: we need to make sure we are helping to foster opportunities for positive social belonging. So we need to create alternatives for someone. Trying to convince someone that their family member is wrong may just lead to that defensiveness and digging in that we talked about before. On the other hand, creating alternative ways to find belonging and alternative social networks can create a bridge out of violent extremism. And I would also reference here what Christian is calling potholes. I think that's a great term, because sometimes those opportunities may exist in a community, but someone's not joining the after-school club or engaging in those groups because there's some pothole that prevents them. Maybe it's depression, maybe it's anxiety, maybe there's something else, a pothole in their life that makes it harder for them to engage in those positive opportunities that are out there and that would allow them to increase that sense of social belonging. So it's really a both and. Let's think about how we can make sure we're taking care of those potholes and also make sure that there are opportunities around someone, so that if the family itself is what's pulling someone towards violent extremism, an individual isn't dependent on just their own family for that. And I think what we saw in Boston was, a very intense relationship between two brothers. And I think, Dzhokhar was really pulled between very positive school experiences at the Cambridge Public School that he went to. And a lot of kids talked about him as a really important part of some social groups there. But on balance, he was pulled towards his brother in that sense of allegiance and connection. So how can we just make sure we're really strengthening those positive opportunities and helping to take down any barriers that might be there that interfere with engaging in those?
Christian, in your book, in your memoir, White American Youth, you candidly describe how you lost your family because of your hateful ideology. Does someone need to hit rock bottom before seeking help? And were there any off ramps in your personal life that might have helped you leave the white power movement sooner?
Big question. So I think there were some opportunities in that 8 years that were potential off ramps for me, and some which I, kind of grabbed a hold of, and some which kind of slipped my grasp. One, the important ones along the way for me were at 19 years old, while I was still in the movement, finding someone. I fell in love with a girl. We got married. We had 2 children, and that challenged that whole sense of identity, community, and purpose that I'd found in the movement, because suddenly, I had this new sense of identity, community, and purpose that was challenging it. And to answer the other part of your question, I don't think someone has to hit rock bottom to be offered an off ramp to it. I think, in fact, we shouldn't wait until somebody hits rock bottom to offer an off ramp, because what I do with helping people disengage is really kind of clean up after the fact. I hate to call myself a garbage man, and certain the people I work with are not garbage, but we are cleaning up after the damage has been done. What we need to do, I think, and Steve said this earlier, is we have in our society terrible access, and certainly terrible equitable access to services that we need to find our way. Right? We all hit potholes, every single one of us. Some of us have the resources to navigate them properly. We have support to navigate them. We're all searching for identity, community, and purpose. What we need to kind of defeat extremism in the long run in a preventative way is we need to provide access to healthcare, access to mental health care, early adolescent mental health care in many cases. We need access to jobs. We need access to education, which many communities don't have. And this is across the board, not just for white communities that are being radicalized, but for communities of color that are suffering just because they don't have access to those resources. So I think, in terms of prevention, this really is a kind of a, social services, approach to combating extremism in the long run. But certainly we have people who are, in this now, and what do we do about them? And I do think that we need access to resources like mine. We need more national access for parents, for loved ones, for teachers, for counselors. And I think we need to train the tools that we already have in place. We have therapists, psychologists, teachers, parents. They are all, first responders, or at least first, observers of the process of radicalization and the people they love. So if we can give them the education that they need to know that they are the tools for this, I think that will go a long way.
I want to stick with Christian. We've been on lockdown, or however you want to describe the pandemic of the last 10, 11 months. Many of us are spending a lot more time online. Christian, can you talk about how vulnerable individuals fall down the digital rabbit holes of conspiracy theories and radicalization, because all of us, our internet usage is going way up, and many people are clicking into these algorithms that are leading them, or Facebook groups that are leading them into these conspiracy theories that ultimately radicalize them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of answered it there partly. If you think back of how I was radicalized, I was, this was pre-consumer internet. I was, 14 years old in 1987, and somebody physically came up to me with those ideas, had to hand me a pamphlet, invite me to a meeting. Fast forward 30 years, and here we are in the age of the internet, when there's not just one vulnerable, kind of marginalized feeling kid in an alley. There are millions of people who are feeling isolated, who are looking for connection and looking for answers to a lot of questions to a lot of the issues that are happening right now: pandemic, job loss, all these things. And it's, you don't have to be in a dark alley anymore to find that information. The internet has become kind of that all-you-can-eat 24-hour hate buffet if you want it. And it doesn't take much to go down that rabbit hole. The algorithms, like you had mentioned, although I think that they're trying to start to understand how that may have served up and curated more radicalizing content for people. If they clicked on a link about something, the internet would offer up more suggestions for you to go further down that rabbit hole. So it wasn't hard to follow that trail. And I think the pandemic with people being online has forced us to, more so than we had in the past, go online for our information. And it's really easy to fall into a bubble of information and to feel rewarded by that bubble, so that, kind of ingesting that information becomes easier.
I'd like to ask the two mental health professionals we have here about how the tech industry can work with mental health professionals to ensure vulnerable individuals are not recruited by extremist groups. Dr. Wine, can you go first, and then Dr. Ellis, please?
Sure. I think just a big picture point. I think one thing that Christian, Heidi, and I are saying is that we can't leave prevention of violent extremism to law enforcement alone. There are other sectors of society that have to get engaged in this. Law enforcement plays a critical role, but if it's left to them, it's not going to succeed. And so that definitely includes mental health professionals, and it definitely includes the tech industry. So, as Christian was saying, I mean, let's acknowledge the simple fact that if you're sad, angry, isolated, and you're on the internet, you have a much greater chance of encountering intolerance, hatred, violence, conspiracy theories than you do mental health or psychosocial support. We need to change that. I mean, we have a vast and frightening online hate ecosystem. We've stood by and let it grow. Most people don't even know it's there. Most parents don't even know that their kids can get involved with that. Tech platforms need to be more aware of this, and they need to do things to get people off their platforms. Government needs to give industry better tools to manage the public discourse, while protecting constitutional rights. Now, tech and mental health have come up with some very interesting, innovative interventions. There's a group called Moonshot CVE that has developed a program whereby, if, like Christian said, you search for something online about hatred, well, you might encounter one of their ads. And if you click on that, then you're led to some educational videos that are trying to speak to you and send you a different message to challenge that ideology. There are other programs out there in the US and in other countries where you have people like counselors who go online and basically try to connect with people who are asking questions, flirting with extremist ideology, and trying to encourage them to join an offline conversation where they invite them into a kind of counseling to try to help them to leave the movement. So these are good innovations. I mean, these are just really small, but they're effective efforts to try to get in there and get a foothold in this online hate ecosystem. The problem is they're a drop in the bucket right now. So we need to develop more of them, and we need to scale them up. We have a lot of work to do in this space.
And Dr. Ellis?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything Steve said. We really need to be taking a whole of society approach. That means, yes, tech company needs to be involved. I think those are some great examples of some innovative interventions that can take place online, but it can't just happen there. Even if the problem is primarily happening online, the solution doesn't necessarily, we can't limit ourselves to that as a solution. We need that in addition to just good old mental health services and psychosocial support structures and after school groups or whatever it may be. We need to make sure that, and now more than ever with COVID-19 going on, kids are turning to their phones and the worlds that exist in there to find all sorts of connection and meaning. And we can't kind of be complacent about that. We need to make sure that we're building the societal structures we need so that it can be a whole of society response, and that there's ways for kids to engage, belong, and be part of communities, and also combat some of that recruitment and hate that's online in that space.
Christian, I want to return to you. The tech industry has taken a couple different approaches regarding extremism. Tens of thousands of accounts that promoted QAnon conspiracy theories were temporarily or permanently suspended from Facebook and Twitter. Some companies have even tried redirecting people as Dr. Wine had mentioned towards alternative content or connecting them directly with intervention providers. What do you think is the most effective approach in your opinion?
I don't think that there's one blanket approach that's going to work, because I think you're dealing with different levels of people. And I do agree that the deplatforming of the influencers is the appropriate thing to do. I look at these tech companies and these social media platforms a lot like, property managers of a massive apartment building with hundreds of units. If there's a tenant who is constantly every night going around and setting fires in the hallways and kicking in doors and urinating in the elevator, it's that responsibility of that property manager to keep the other tenants safe. However, if that, person starts going down the hallways and people are opening their doors and letting them in, those people shouldn't be deplatformed. Those people need an off-ramp, right? And oftentimes by deplatforming the average person who is following these groups, you're sending them further into it, because you're cutting off their options, for that community and for that camaraderie and purpose. So, I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach, and, maybe metaphorically cutting the head off the snake, where you have the influencers, the ones who are the recruiters, the ones who are propagandizing. There really shouldn't be a place for them, in the town square. But however, the people who are maybe affected by that stuff, we need to have programs. We need to have access to off ramps for those people, especially as they're falling off of these groups, because I guarantee you, if we're not helping them off ramp, they're being on ramped somewhere else. And it isn't always, a good option.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you to comment on how you think the pandemic has impacted support of extremist groups. Are we going to see an uptick in attacks because of social distancing and quarantines? Will the current threat landscape morph into something else? Let's start with Dr. Ellis, and then go to Dr. Wine, and then close out with Christian.
Thanks, Mike. And I'll make this brief because I think what we've already been talking about has laid it out. So social belonging is protective. There's some other factors like trust in your government, that's protective. What we've seen during this pandemic has been really deeply concerning to me, because both the challenges of social distancing and quarantines, as well as the frustration with government response, has likely undercut those really essential protective factors. We've also seen a big uptick in mental health problems. And I think this pandemic has the potential to create a perfect storm. But I'm a bit of an optimist, and I also like to think that by knowing these things, we can try to get out ahead of it. So we have an opportunity here to creatively work to promote a sense of cohesion as we come through this together, to prioritize efforts like opening schools, shoring up our mental health services, making sure they're available to everybody, course correcting government response so that vaccine distribution is equitable and fair. And I think if we really focus our attention on building those robust protective factors during this time, we can try to cut off some of those potential negative effects.
And Dr. Wine.
Well, I think the pandemic has certainly added to our challenges. Extremist organizations have been exploiting the pandemic to spread their conspiracy theories and disinformation and to undermine the public's trust in governments and law enforcement. And in the US, we're also seeing just a rise in crime and violent crime in general. I think that, as I said before, we should recognize that first, that law enforcement alone cannot prevent and stop extremism. We need all of these other civil society players to be engaged: mental health professionals, social service providers, educators, family and community members, faith leaders. And I think what we really need to recognize is that honestly, the US's preventive capacities in this area are abysmally low. If you compare what we do in our country with what happens in other Western countries, for example, in Europe or Australia, they have much, much more developed preventive capacities. I think it's no accident that we also have an abysmal situation with the pandemic. That also reflects very bad, neglected public health capacities in our country. So I think those things are related. Let this moment be a wake-up call that we need to strengthen prevention regarding public health, regarding public safety, and regarding mental health in order to prevent even worse situations from developing.
And Christian, we've known each other for 5 years now, and even in 2016, you talked about things that were going to happen before they were in the media. You have your finger on the pulse of these movements. What do you think is going to happen over the next couple months, couple years?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to paint like this really, dismal picture of what's to come, but I do think it is going to get worse before it gets better. I also want people to not make the mistake of thinking that the only problem is what they saw on January 6th in terms of the number of people or the types of people that are involved in this. I really do think we're facing a really big problem of the number of people who are now gravitating not to just the right, but to extreme positions that, see the same things that I thought, when I was a neo-Nazi as the outcome, and they share that vision. And that to me is really, really troubling. I do think that we need to, to kind of tail on the last question you asked them. I think we can defeat this kind of the same way we can defeat the pandemic, right? We have to quote unquote treat the sick, which is what I do in terms of, helping people disengage, but we also have to inoculate the population from getting sick, and that will prevent future generations from going down that path. And I think the really complicated answer for that, but I think that there's a lot we can do in terms of access to the things that both Dr. Ellis and Dr. Wine mentioned. Except it makes it extremely difficult during a pandemic to help because how I help people is kind of, I have to buck the, what I'm being told for. I want to be close to people. I need to see them. they need to have access to their families. They need to have access to the support systems, which during a pandemic are sometimes really, really hard to get access to. But I have hope we're going to get, through this and we are going to get to a place where it's not just normal, but it is the start of hopefully a new normal going forward, where we understand that we need access to each other, we need access to services, we need, more positive versions of identity and community and purpose that we can share together. And I think we'll get through it. But like Steve said, it's not a law enforcement answer. I think it's an all-encompassing kind of whole of society answer, like Dr. Ellis said as well.
I want to thank each of you. I've worked with all of you, each of you, for many years, but I feel like I've learned a lot of new things today. It's been an amazing discussion. I also want to thank South by Southwest for the opportunity to discuss this topic, and everyone who's watching. Hopefully, we get to have these discussions in person next year. Before we log off, I want to make a simple ask of the audience. If you see someone whom you believe is in the process of radicalizing, get them help. Call a mental health professional, call a religious leader, or call an organization like Christians, the Free Radicals Project. The earlier someone gets the help, the less harm they will cause to themselves and others. Thank you so much again for your time.